Hello, Dragonfire here, and I just finished watching the first 8 Friday the 13th movies. Of course, these were the 8 that were done under Paramount, and the 8 that came out in the 80s. Now, I've seen these movies before many times, but this was specifically watching them to get ready to do a review. Um, Rewatching them over again for over the past several months. I've watched all 8 of these movies, and even though I haven't finished the franchise as it currently is right now, I thought I would go ahead and do a review on the first 8. I've got this box set here, the 8 original movies. Little, I believe these things are called Funko Pops. Yeah, Funko Pops or Pocket Pop keychain. I don't know. And so, yeah, I watched these 8 movies. Again, these are the 8 that came out during the 1980s. And, okay, so, we have Friday the 13th. Now, this version available on DVD is the uncut version. I'll probably say a little bit more about that when I get to that movie specifically, but just to give you the rundown of what these movies are called, what they're known by, give you a brief explanation. So we have Friday the 13th. This is the uncut version included in this DVD box set. You have, of course, part 2 and part 3, 3D, doing the 3D gimmick on part 3. Part 4 is not actually included in the title of the fourth movie. Instead, it's called The Final Chapter, Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. Um, so, that's, as we'll see, didn't really happen. They uh, came back the very next year because part 4 was 1984, and in 1985 we got A New Beginning. Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning. Part 6 is Jason Lives, Part 7, The New Blood, and Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Alright, so that is the rundown. Part 1 came out in 1980, Part 2 in 81, Part 3 in 82. They skipped 83, and then 84 was the final chapter. 85, A New Beginning. 86, Jason Lives. I'm thinking they skipped 87. 88 was The New Blood, and finally 89 was Jason Takes Manhattan. So in 10 years, 1980 to 1989, they put out 8 films, only skipping 83 and 87. So this franchise, it's like watching how filmmaking grows from year to year. It's like a microcosm study of the 1980s in filmmaking, particularly in the horror movie genre. In the first movie, like with a lot of successful horror franchises, the first movie was actually originally an independent movie, very low budget, and was, or relatively low budget by Hollywood standards at the time. It was basically considered independent, and then it was picked up by Paramount and distributed, and then Paramount took over doing the sequels. Um, this is of course iconic, and of course we got Jason on the cover here, and Jason Voorhees is one of those iconic characters. Arguably, I would say he might be like the second most iconic of any of those characters that was created in either 70s or 80s, and then continued into the 90s and beyond. But the only one I would say would be more iconic than Jason Voorhees might be Freddy Krueger. But he's definitely right up there with any of them. Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th series is right up there with your Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, your Chucky the Killer Doll from Child's Play movies, Pinhead from Hellraiser, Michael Myers from Halloween, Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so on and so forth. He's just one of those type of characters. So, yeah, this is interesting series of movies. I'm going to open the case here, take out the DVD set. It needs all that extra space because the Funko Pop is in there. But this is the actual DVD case. Now, you may have seen this is sold separately by itself as well. I think just recently it came out on Blu-ray as well. The whole set of movies came out on Blu-ray, but basically the same set. Alright, let's talk about Friday the 13th, which came out in 1980. Most of the film was shot in 79, and that's a pretty typical thing that happens with movies. A lot of times they don't come out until the year after they're shot because they spend all this time in post-production and everything like that, editing, everything that happens that goes into putting together a final film before it can be released in a movie theater. So one of the reasons I mentioned this was shot in 79 is the debate over whether or not this movie takes place in 79 or 80. So we see the opening scenes, we see a couple of camp counselors killed in the 1950s, and then it flash forwards to quote modern day, and then that's what the title that comes up on the screen tells you, is that we're in modern day now. So I think most audiences would assume that that's the year that the film came out, which would be 1980. We're also it also comes up on the screen to tell us that it is Friday, June 13th. That date of Friday, June 13th is confirmed by a voice that we hear on the radio. So the radio station DJ says that it is Friday, June 13th as well. But the year is never specifically mentioned in the film itself. It just says modern day. Now, if we look at a calendar for the year, there was actually, June 13th did actually fall on Friday in the year 1980. Now, I know this is going to get a humongous glare here on the screen, but I do have the calendar pulled up on my phone. I don't think it's really visible, just too much glare. But June 13th, 1980 was on a Friday. And then if we go back to 1979, hope I'm not getting too nerdy for you all, but in 1979, June 13th fell on a Wednesday. So it seems clear that the filmmakers of the first movie were intending it to be set on June 13th, 1980, although they just said modern day because they wanted to leave the film more open, I think, to future viewers of the film, just saying modern day instead of pinning a particular year on it. Now, later on in the final chapter, which of course is the fourth movie, they show the gravestone of Pamela Voorhees, one of the people who dies in the first movie, and she is said to have died in 1979, which was, of course, the year that the film was shot, not the year that it came out, and it seems to go against the narrative. So, but if we take the sequels into account, and that sequel giving us her dying in 1979, not 1980, that would mean that the events of the first film happened in 79, not 80, which kind of checks out. I mean, it's close enough to, quote, modern day. The film came out in 80, shot in 79, so yeah, 79 could be modern day for the audience watching at the time. Anyway, I'm a nerd when it comes to those type of dates and those weird things like that, so I enjoy doing all that kind of stuff. But it seems that that's the intent of the movie. At least it's the intent of the sequel, to set it on that date. I don't think that they really, understood the continuity issues that would create. They probably just misunderstood, not realizing that probably the people who made the first movie intended it to be set in 1980, but they put it back in 79 in the sequels. So, we just have to assume that they live in an alternate universe where 1979, June 13th, 1979 fell on a Friday in the alternate universe. Alright. Friday the 13th Part 2. Oh wait, I didn't really even talk about the film. I didn't even really talk about Part 1. Okay. My thoughts on Part 1. It's fun, it's interesting, it's one of the prototypical slashers that really set the genre that would be imitated by so many other movies that would follow, including movies in its own franchise. Of course, it itself is admittedly a ripoff of Halloween. The filmmakers have said that they wanted to make their own version of Halloween, although I'm not sure calling it a ripoff is quite accurate, because I do think that it does enough of its own things to be its own thing. It's definitely within the same genre, but it's not a ripoff in the bad sense of the word. It's just taking that genre and taking those particular things and making it up to be its own thing. But basically, it sets up the formula. They go there for summer camp. They're in the woods. They're next to Camp Crystal Lake, and then they get killed off one by one. And in the end, with absolutely no setup at all, really, we find out that it's Mrs. Voorhees is the killer. Now, who is Mrs. Voorhees? We actually haven't been introduced to her at all during the entirety of the film. She only shows up at the very end. There is some setup for this. Earlier in the movie, we do have a guy talking to one of the camp counselors. He tells her that years ago, that the camp has experienced all these different things. There's been fires, there's been deaths, there's been this and that. He mentions two camp counselors dying in the 1950s, which is what we saw in the opening scene of the film from the killer's point of view. So we didn't see who the killer was, but we know that camp counselors died back then, and that the camp has been closed down ever since. And he also mentions that the year before those two camp counselors were murdered, that a little boy drowned in the lake. And that sets up the end of the film, where we find out Mrs. Voorhees is the mother of the little boy who drowned. That little boy who drowned, his name was Jason. So that's the premise of the film. Sorry to spoil the end of it for you, but it's been out since 1980. Go watch it if you haven't seen it yet. Come on, what are you waiting for? In fact, turn off this review and watch the Friday the 13th movies. My goodness. Okay. and then come back to this review to hear my thoughts about them. Alright. Friday the 13th, Part 2. In this movie, we have a scene where we see the only surviving member, really the only surviving significant character from the first movie gets killed off at the very beginning of the movie. Later on, we get an expedition scene where it is explained that she disappeared a couple months after the incident. So that would mean that after she was killed, that her body was hidden and never found, apparently. We also learn in the scene that it's been 5 years since the massacre, where Mrs. Voorhees did the killings, the revenge killings. They also say that actually Jason's body was never found. The little boy, the little Jason Voorhees, son of Mrs. Voorhees, who was the killer in the first movie, his body was never found. So it is speculated in this movie that actually Jason might have still been alive this whole time. I guess he's been living in the woods. Maybe he killed some people and took their clothing, and that's why he wears clothes in this movie. They do show a shack in the woods, and presumably that's where Jason has been living this entire time, eating whatever he can find, I guess. But basically, yeah, between, 1957, I think is when Jason drowned. He was about, I think they indicate he was about 8 years old, something to that effect. I guess he didn't actually drown, but he made it out of the water, and he's been living in the woods this whole time. And now, of course, he's a full-grown man, because this is 5 years after the first one, which, depending on whether you use the 79 or 80 date, it's either 84 or 85. Based on part 4, we'll go with the 79 date, and we'll say this one takes place in 84, 5 years after that. So finally, 5 years later, they are once again attempting to reopen the camp, Camp Crystal Lake, off of Lake Crystal Lake, off the Crystal Lake. And they're doing it again. The camp counselors are arriving. The kids haven't gotten there yet. Same setup as the first movie. And once again, people start dying one by one. And pretty much left with the same scenario. You get down in a scenario, and it seems like maybe at the end of the movie, maybe they kill Jason. And once again, just like the first movie, there's the dream sequence there where it's kind of unclear. Did it really happen? Did it not really happen? Just like with the dream sequence of the first movie. Or what might be a dream sequence or might not be a dream sequence, but I think most people take it as a dream sequence. That's why I'm calling it a dream sequence. But, there are theories that maybe it really happened. It just depends on how you take all of this stuff. Of course, one of the big questions was Jason ever really dead or not? Did he really drown? And is the Jason that we see in part 2, where he now becomes the killer, is it a supernatural Jason, or is it a human Jason? Because Jason was actually a real person who just never really drowned, and it wasn't like his ghost or his resurrected corpse coming back or anything. This was just the human Jason. This Jason does seem to be more human than some of the ones that appear in the later films. But, you can take it either way. You can say that at the end of the first movie, Jason rose from the dead. You can say, there's even a theory out there that Jason helped Mrs. Voorhees kill people in the original movie. That Jason was never really dead. He was helping Pamela Voorhees kill everyone. But it's just one of those things, one of those movie continuity things where I think fans care more about the continuity sometimes than the actual filmmakers do. So whatever, Jason is alive. I mean, it's indicated that he didn't really drown, he just almost drowned, which is why they never found the body. So you can take it either way that you want to take it. Is Jason a supernatural being who rose from the dead, meaning he really did drown as a little boy, or is he a human who just almost drowned and has been living as a nomad in the woods? Your choice, I guess. But anyway, he, of course, goes on a rampage, kills everybody. They finally get him. Is it over? Well, part 3 picks up immediately after part 2. And by the way, in part 2, they do indicate that it is a Friday. I don't think the words 13th are ever said. But I think the whole movie takes place on Friday and into the night. And so I don't think there's more than one day. I think just part 2 all takes place on that one day into the night, and then part 3 the night is over and the next morning. So this is all taking place on Friday and Friday night into Saturday morning, and part 3 picks up on Saturday morning, the very next day. This time it's a group of people who are just going to stay in the woods. They're staying in a different part of the area, but still close to the lake. But they're not on the campgrounds where all the murders have just taken place, but in a different area, but still in the general area of where the previous movies have taken place. So they're close to Camp Crystal Lake. They're in the Crystal Lake community, Crystal Lake area. And this one is the one with all the 3D gimmicks going on. It's always back and forth in your face. And the movie suffers from just the shots and everything being set up especially for 3D, and it's just one of those gimmicky movies. But it's really interesting. In the second movie, where we see Jason actually active and killing people for most of the movie, he's wearing a bag over his head when you can actually see him, and very much taken from the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown. I think came out before Friday the 13th, and he looks very much like the killer in that movie, with the bag over his head. And then we have part 3. Jason picks up a mask, the hockey mask, the famous hockey mask that he is known for. He gets it off a character named Shelly, a character who likes wearing masks and likes pulling pranks and scaring people. Shelly is the Boy Who Cried Wolf character. He pretends and fakes to be injured and do stuff like that because he wants to get attention. And so when Jason actually kills him, people think it's another prank again, that he's just got fake blood and pretending to die or whatever. And then when they actually realize that he's actually being killed, it's like, oh no, Jason's on the loose. But yeah, they thought they took out Jason at the end of part 2, but at the end of part 2 he was just missing. Part of the ending was just a dream, and Jason is still on the loose, and now he finds these people who we meet in part 3. And same type of thing ensues. Jason kills everybody, except for it gets down to a few final characters, 1 or 2, whatever, and, they think they take him out again. At the end of this movie, I think there's also another dream sequence that goes on. Okay, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. This was the one where they actually planned on killing Jason. They thought, we're done with these movies. I think part 3 have been diminishing returns, and some of the other movies and franchises were starting to go a little downhill. and they were thinking, okay, maybe it's time. However, this came out in 1984, same year as A Nightmare on Elm Street came out, the first one, part one. Nightmare on Elm Street would introduce Freddy Krueger. And also, this movie was a really good movie, and I think did quite well. And so they're like, oh, Nightmare on Elm Street's doing well, Friday the 13th is doing well. Um, Maybe this slasher genre thing isn't dead. Maybe there's still stuff, so they ended up doing another one in '85. But, originally the plan was for this to be done. Final chapter, part 4. So, this is, I just love this one. They've got Corey Feldman and Crispin Glover in this. And Corey Feldman, you may remember from The Goonies, Crispin Glover from Back to the Future. This one has the Doublemint twins in it, and they're double your pleasure, double your fun. Yeah, love Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It's a pretty cool movie, and just a fun one to watch. Of course, they go through, and at the end of this one, they definitively kill Jason. Like, it seems like Jason is really dead. In fact, he is really dead, as confirmed by the sequel. So that's the progress that they make. And again, part 3 picks up the day after part 2, and the final chapter of part 4 picks up the day after part 3. So if you look through all these movies, even if you count, okay, well, maybe there was a day to night switch there and this and that, these 3 movies, parts 2, 3, and 4, take place in less than a week. There's less than a week worth of time here. It's basically just a weekend. It's maybe 3, 4, 5 days at the most for all 3 movies. Which then means that if we have the first movie taking place in '79, and the second movie says it's been 5 years since the events of that movie, that would mean that they're taking place in '84, which means that by the end of this movie we've caught up with real time. It's real time 1984, which is the year that the movie final chapter was released. So, parts 2, 3, and 4 are all taking place in '84, so we've caught up with real time. Now, the character who kills Jason in part 4 is a character by the name of Tommy Jarvis, and in part 5 we pick up with Tommy Jarvis. Numerous years has passed. He's probably around 17, 18 years old, and played by a different actor. But it's a new beginning. They tried to reboot the franchise. I mean, they started with Pamela Voorhees as the killer, Mrs. Voorhees, Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, and then they moved on to Jason Voorhees as the killer. This movie has a copycat killer. I won't even spoil it, but basically, yeah, he's dressing up like Jason Voorhees, and you can watch the movie, find out exactly what happens. But Tommy has got to fight this Jason copycat. But other than not being a Voorhees, this one just follows the formula of the other movies, the 4 movies that came before it, and most of the movies that come after it as well. It's the same basic formula: people in the woods, people dying. Yeah. No, Tommy goes to a place called Pinehurst, I believe it is, which is not near Crystal Lake. And yeah, he's being hunted down by a copycat killer, Jason Voorhees impersonator. It's a pretty fun movie. I like it. All of these are not bad. Now, I wanted to mention something about the Final Cut version of this. Unfortunately, I think that most of the DVDs available right now are the Final Cut. I will say that the Final Cut gives you a little bit more. I'm talking about or the uncut for part 1. I'm just flipping back to part 1 right now. Uncut. It is longer. It may give you a little more character development. It may help you identify with the characters a little bit more. It just depends on your point of view. You could view it as long and unnecessary, and that the things that were cut actually make the movie better because they make it faster paced. But they have been added back in, and this is the available that most people have, is the so-called uncut version rather than the theatrical cut version. Yeah, for those who think it moves along, the first movie moves along too slow and is too boring, see if you can find the theatrical cut before they added all the extra stuff back in. Okay. I was talking about number 5. I think that pretty much sums it up. Yep. Tommy Jarvis has to fight a Jason impersonator. Okay. Friday the 13th, part 6, Jason Lives. Part 5 was called A New Beginning for a reason. They wanted to kind of restart the franchise. They wanted to continue kind of going down the route of just basically saying, Jason doesn't have to be our killer. We can move on. However, the fan reaction to part 5 was, we want Jason back. So, part 6 was called Jason Lives. In fact, in some of the posters, some of the advertising, and the original director wanted to call it Jason Lives as the title, and Friday the 13th Part 6 as the subtitle. Of course, other people wanted it the other way, no, it's got to be Friday the 13th Part 6 because it's an established franchise. You can make Jason Lives the subtitle. So there are posters made each way, and the title was flipped back and forth in some of the advertising. But this is Jason Lives. This is letting the fans know Jason is back, and it's the real Jason, not the fake Jason, not the Jason impersonator we had in the last movie. Right? So you may say, well, Jason was really dead, right? They affirmed that. They established that Jason actually died at the end of Final Chapter, right? Yes, he did. So, all these years, Tommy Jarvis has been obsessed with him. By the way, Part 6, the third movie featuring Tommy Jarvis, the only character, I think, other than Jason himself, and maybe Mrs. Voorhees, who comes back in dream sequences and whatnot throughout the franchise or whatever. I think that Jason, Mrs. Voorhees, and Tommy Jarvis are the only characters to appear in 3 or more movies, if you count dream versions of Mrs. Voorhees. But when basically Tommy is obsessed with Jason, and the fans were, and in order to make sure Jason is actually dead and nothing can happen, there's elements that seem supernatural in the first 5 movies. Like maybe the spirit of Jason is still haunting Tommy, or there's all these supernatural elements that are going on. But anyway, if there weren't supernatural elements in the first 5 movies, if they could all be explained through natural means, Part 6 blows the door open and says, no, this is a supernatural franchise. From this point on, you can't even argue it anymore. It's definitely supernatural. So, Tommy goes to see Jason's grave. He digs him up. It's contradicting the last movie before this, in which they claim that Jason had been cremated. But maybe the person who said that just had misinformation, just didn't know the truth, that Jason was actually buried in a grave. So anyway, Tommy goes and digs Jason up. He is getting ready, pour gasoline on Jason's body, and he's going to burn the remains and do the cremation himself to make sure Jason is gone once and for all. But in a very ironic twist, lightning strikes Jason's body, and kind of like Frankenstein, this brings him back to life. So now Jason has been raised alive as this kind of undead zombie type deal. So now he's this resurrected supernatural being come back from the dead. So actually, by trying to ensure that something like this didn't happen, Tommy Jarvis um, uh, did in fact actually cause the very thing he was trying to prevent. Very ironic. Okay, so Jason comes back. He starts killing people again. Tommy, he, I guess, has been learning and going through and finding magic stuff, which is, I guess, maybe why he was afraid Jason was going to come back from the grave in the first place. Sees that way to lay Jason to rest is by returning to the place where he originally died. So I guess we're going with the narrative now that Jason actually did drown back in 1957 or 56, whatever year that was supposed to take place. You know, even though the second movie, the characters in that movie speculated that Jason maybe really didn't drown. I mean, did he drown or did he not drown? Or how does the magic spell work if he didn't really drown, so maybe he did drown? Or maybe the magic spell works when he didn't drown. I don't know. Anyway, Tommy gets this idea that if he is able to get Jason back into the lake and put him down there again, that it will basically stop Jason, you know, kind of in a magical way or whatever. So of course Jason is loose. He kills a bunch of people. He tries to kill Tommy and it's back and forth. And eventually he is able to get a giant chain, and with Jason on one end of the chain and a rock on the other end of the chain, is able to chain Jason to the bottom of the lake. And he also chops part of his neck with a boat motor and stuff. So Jason ends up trapped at the bottom of the lake in this movie. It's just fun. I do think it's cool how each movie picks up where the previous movie left off, in the sense that, you know, it's like part 2 picks up with Alice, the character from the previous movie, and explains more about Jason. Part 3 picks up immediately the next day. Part 4 picks up immediately the next day. Part 5 continues the story of Tommy Jarvis. Part 6, we go back to Tommy Jarvis and find Jason's grave and we get him out of the grave. And it continues like this for the first 8 movies. So they were at least remembering where the last movie left off and picking up where that movie left off. So they're not ignoring continuity in that way. Part 7, The New Blood. This is a really interesting one. Of course, Jason, through telekinetic powers, well, I was going to say, of course, Jason finds a way out of the lake, but it's through telekinetic powers of, telekinesis accidentally frees Jason from the lake, from a character that has, psychokinetic powers, that is just like learning how to use them and whatnot. So this character was based off Carrie from the movie Carrie, and basically, telekinesis can move things with their mind. The fact that she has these like supernatural powers gives her the ability to fight back against Jason, because Jason is this undead zombie thing, just as a killing machine. So it's a thing where you're not strong enough to fight him. You can't match him strength for strength. So this is how you fight Jason. You can fight Jason. Now he has someone to actually fight him, because she has these supernatural powers that she can use to fight back. And so this is an interesting, different way of framing the movie and giving you something different in this movie. The New Blood. I don't know why they chose the word New Blood, but it's interesting. But I guess it's because now there's someone else on Jason's level, a new player in the game, I guess. In this movie, again, Jason gets free from the lake. He kills people. He fights. He has his final showdown with the girl with the psychic powers. And then this movie ends with Jason once again at the bottom of the lake, this time pulled down by a ghost. And she summons, like, kind of the ghost of her father, who drowned in that lake many years earlier. So, she gets a little help from the dead to eventually defeat Jason. Part 8, Jason takes Manhattan. Jason, we find him kind of under a lot of rubbish from the collapse of the dock that he was on when he got pulled under, and so he's been trapped in the lake since part of the end of part 7. But of course, again, something happens. He gets shot with some electricity. He fights his way through the rubbish that is on top and comes up again. He gets out of the lake. So now Jason is taking a boat to Manhattan. And this movie is called Jason Takes Manhattan. Of course, he spends most of it on the boat, not actually in the city. And even when he is in the city, they actually shot most of it in Vancouver, and then only had actually one day and one night in which they were allowed to shoot in Times Square, and did the scenes in Times Square. It's the only part of the movie that's actually in New York, but they do have Vancouver in what I think is supposed to be like a dystopian future, and actually kind of makes sense that it would take place in the future. I mean, remember that in 84 with Final Chapter we were in real time 84, the same year the movie came out, as we discussed earlier, but then we fast forward several years because Tommy Jarvis is several years older in part 5. Then we fast forward several years again because he's several years older in part 6 than he was in part 5. Of course, Tommy Jarvis in the 3 movies is played by 3 different actors, but it is all supposed to be the same character. And then in New Blood, once again, there is a time jump because we see the character there that is supposed to have the psychokinetic powers as a little girl, and apparently Jason is at the lake when she's a little girl, and then we see her several years older, about 17 or 18 years old, once again, revisiting the lake. So Jason has been down there that whole time. So quite a bit of time is passing when you jump from Tommy Jarvis being somewhere between 8 and 12 years old in part 4. I'm not really sure exactly how old he's supposed to be, but he's definitely no older than 12, no younger than 8. And he's like 17 or 18 in the second movie, and he's probably around 24 in the third movie, the 3 movies that he's in. And then we have another time jump with the character going from, in part 7, the Carrie-like character going from like about 8, 9, or 10, somewhere in that range, to about 17 or 18. So definitely we add up all those years. Definitely we're not in 1989 by the time we get to the film that came out in the year 1989. We're a ways in the future, in my estimation. So, apparently in the future, every night, at a certain time, the sewers of New York City are flooded with toxic waste. I guess they're cleansing out the nuclear power plants. I don't know. But anyway, that I guess you could call it science fiction type of story is how they kill Jason in this movie. They shoot him with toxic waste. At the end of the movie, he gets caught in the sewer at the wrong time, so he hits toxic waste, hits him, and that's what kills Jason in this movie. But all these movies follow the same formula. Now, I should mention, that the name of the town in part 6, as the officials in the town have changed once Tommy Jarvis goes to Crystal Lake to try and destroy Jason's body once and for all, but accidentally ends up resurrecting it in part 6. The name of the town has been named to Forest Green. No longer is it Crystal Lake. And in part 7, they have changed it back to Crystal Lake again. I think that it does make sense if you think that maybe when she's a little girl, it's still Forest Green, and then it gets changed to Crystal Lake by the time she turns 17. That gives enough time that they just decided to change it back. Just go ahead and change it back. I mean, after all, the people who died in part 6, I mean, I guess the town just figured it couldn't outrun its history, so it might as well be called Crystal Lake. Anyway, okay, with Jason Takes Manhattan, this is the one that I think most people would pick as their least favorite of the original run. And maybe their least favorite of the franchise, or at least towards the bottom of the franchise. Now, of course, there are more movies that came out after this. I'm not going to give my ranking of the entire franchise, not yet. I've just done my review of the movies, just giving a brief overview of what the movies are about and the kind of nerdy things I find interesting about the movies and fun about the movies. Yeah, there's some ridiculous stuff going on in Jason Takes Manhattan. Of course, it doesn't deliver on its promise and to actually see Jason in New York, except for very briefly. But it is kind of fun. It's a fun movie. It's fun for what it is. None of these movies are masterpieces. None of them are done particularly well. They're all just kind of this blocky movies in this slasher subgenre of general horror movies, and these are the movies, of course, during the 1980s that made Jason such an icon. They're recognizable, the hockey mask, everything like that. Yeah, these are interesting movies. These are fun movies. I just have fun with the kills. Of course, it's the gore, it's the kills, it's the everything that happens during these movies that's why the fans go for them. It is to see the kills, the gore is creative, and there's a certain art to the way it is done. But anyway, definitely, if I didn't say this before, check out Friday the 13th. This is the original set of movies done in the 1980s. All 8 of them are that were at least released in the 80s. Most of them were probably shot principal photography the year before they were released. Alright. We're just about to hit the 15-minute mark. I'm going to keep this one under an hour. Like, share, subscribe, check out my channel. Got some great videos. But yeah, Friday the 13th, It's just a lot of fun. Don't take the movies seriously. Just have fun with them. Whatever fun looks like for you. If fun looks like for you trying to figure out the timeline, exactly what year everything happens, and all this kind of stuff, go for it. You know, if fun looks like for you just watching the kills, the gore, the whatever, go for that too. All right. Uh, oh, by the way, take a look at Jason's face every time he gets the mask taken off. Not consistent from movie to movie. Wildly inconsistent from movie to movie. But that's part of the fun. Alright. I'm going to cut it off there. Like, share, subscribe. Come back to my channel. God bless. Have a wonderful day.